My friends, if you feel a strange tension in your chest when you hear the word authority, if something in you tightens or recoils as though confronted by a foreign force, I would ask you not to dismiss this reaction too quickly. Do not moralize it. Do not rush to explain it away by social theory or childhood anecdotes alone. Sit with it, because this discomfort is not accidental, it is psychic. It belongs to a long history inside you, a history of adaptation, accommodation, and survival that has quietly shaped the structure of your soul. I speak to you now not as a man delivering conclusions, but as one who has listened for decades to the secret language of the psyche, again and again, in dreams, in symptoms, in the quiet despair of those who appear outwardly successful yet inwardly hollow. I have seen the same pattern emerge: a human being who has spent a lifetime adapting to the demands of others, to the expectations of family, culture, relationships, and invisible emotional climates, eventually encounters a moment when inner authority begins to stir, and when it does not arrive as relief, it arrives as unease. This surprises many people. They believe that authority, especially inner authority, should feel empowering, liberating, even triumphant. But the psyche is not governed by slogans. What has been long repressed does not return as comfort. It returns as disturbance. Consider what adaptation truly means. Adaptation is not merely learning manners or social skills. In its deeper psychological sense, adaptation is the gradual shaping of the ego around external necessity. The child learns very early, long before language is refined, what is welcomed and what is dangerous, which emotions preserve connection and which threaten it, which impulses are met with warmth and which are met with withdrawal, ridicule, or punishment. Over time, the psyche learns to bend, and bending, at first, is wisdom. It is life-preserving. But what is bent for too long begins to forget its original form. In many of you, especially those we might call sensitive, empathic, or intuitively attuned, adaptation did not remain a temporary strategy. It became an identity. You learn to read the room before you read yourself. You learn to anticipate needs before you recognize desires. You learn to soften your presence, to make yourself palatable, to be acceptable rather than authentic. And because this strategy worked, because it brought safety, approval, or at least reduced conflict, it became unconscious, it became fate. Now imagine what happens when, after decades of this pattern, the psyche begins to reorganize itself. Perhaps it occurs in midlife, perhaps after a crisis, a betrayal, an illness, or simply a quiet exhaustion that no longer allows the old performance to continue. The self, that deeper regulating center of the psyche, begins to press for reorientation. Something within you starts to say no without asking permission. A boundary appears before you have time to justify it. An inner voice speaks with a firmness that feels unfamiliar. And this is where the discomfort arises. Because authority, when you have never been allowed to possess it, feels like aggression. Direction feels like danger. Certainty feels like cruelty. To the adapted psyche, Authority is something that has always belonged to others, parents, teachers, institutions, emotionally dominant figures. Authority was something you responded to, adjusted around, or survived. It was never something you inhabited. So when authority begins to arise from within, it is experienced at first as an intrusion. The ego asks, who am I becoming? Why do I feel harder? Why do I feel less accommodating? Why does saying yes feel false and saying no feel terrifying? The adapted ego interprets inner authority as a violation of its moral code. Because its morality was formed around relationship preservation, not individuation. Here we must speak of the shadow. Everything you were not allowed to be did not disappear. It went underground. The anger that would have threatened attachment, the decisiveness that would have been called selfish, the confidence that would have been labeled arrogance. These qualities did not vanish, they became shadow. And because they were split off early, they remained primitive, unintegrated, and emotionally charged. Thus, when authority begins to return, it does not feel clean or noble. It feels dark. It feels excessive. It feels dangerous. The shadow does not knock politely. It erupts. Many people, at this stage, retreat. They interpret the discomfort as evidence that something is wrong. They rush back into old patterns of accommodation, people-pleasing, and self-erasure, believing they are choosing kindness or humility, when in truth they are choosing familiarity. The psyche prefers familiar suffering to unfamiliar wholeness. But if you listen carefully, you will notice something subtle. The discomfort of emerging authority is different from the pain of self-betrayal. One constricts and deadens, the other disturbs and energizes. One makes life smaller, the other makes it strange, intenser, and alive. Authority feels uncomfortable because it demands responsibility. When you are adapted, responsibility is diffuse. You respond, you react, you accommodate. The center of gravity lies outside you, but authority recenters the psyche. Suddenly, you are the one who must decide, and decision is frightening to the adapted soul, because it means you can no longer hide behind circumstances or expectations. You can no longer say, I had no choice. In analysis, I have often seen dreams at this stage involving unfamiliar houses, locked rooms, or strange figures who appear both threatening and magnetic. These are images of the self approaching consciousness. The locked room is the part of the psyche that has never been lived. The threatening figure is the shadowed authority that has been excluded. The dream does not ask whether you like these figures, it asks whether you will meet them. Let me be clear, authority is not domination. Inner authority is not the desire to control others. That confusion belongs to those who have never differentiated power from compensation. True authority is alignment with one's own psychic law. It is obedience to the self rather than submission to the crowd. But for one who has lived by adaptation, even this feels transgressive. You may notice guilt arising without a clear object. You have done nothing wrong, yet you feel as though you have. This is not moral guilt. It is separation anxiety at the level of the psyche. Part of you believes that by becoming authoritative, you will lose love, belonging, or safety. And perhaps in some relationships you will, but the psyche is not designed to preserve every bond. It is designed to become whole. Authority feels uncomfortable because it ends unconscious contracts. Contracts that said, I will remain small if you remain pleased. I will carry the emotional weight so that others do not have to. I will translate myself into acceptable forms. These contracts were never spoken, yet they governed your life. Authority dissolves them, and dissolution feels like loss before it feels like freedom. If you stay with this discomfort, if you do not immediately anesthetize it with old behaviors, something remarkable begins to happen. The shadowed authority starts to refine itself. It becomes less reactive, less harsh, less absolute. What was once raw anger becomes clarity. What was once rigidity becomes structure. What was once fear becomes grounded presence. But this refinement cannot occur without passage through discomfort. There is no shortcut. Individuation is not a cosmetic process. It is an alchemical one. You see, the psyche has its own ethics, distinct from social morality. Its ethic is wholeness, and wholeness often requires that we endure being misunderstood, even by ourselves. For a time, authority feels uncomfortable because it marks the moment when the adapted persona begins to loosen its grip, and the deeper personality steps forward, not asking to be liked, but insisting on being lived. This is only the beginning of the journey. In the next movement of our exploration, we must look more closely at how lifelong adaptation shapes the nervous system, the body, and the unconscious expectations that make authority feel unsafe at a visceral level, not merely an intellectual one. Only then can we understand why this discomfort is not a pathology, but a signal. Let us continue, then, and descend a little deeper, for what we have touched so far belongs mostly to the symbolic and moral layers of the psyche. Yet, the discomfort you feel in the presence of authority is not only symbolic, it is not only psychological in the abstract sense, it is somatic. It lives in the body, it lives in the nervous system, and unless we understand this, many of you will mistakenly believe that your reaction is weakness, immaturity, or a failure of courage, when in fact it is the residue of long adaptation written into flesh and nerve. A lifetime of adaptation trains the organism to remain vigilant. The adapted psyche does not rest in itself, it orients outward, scanning for cues, reading microsignals, anticipating shifts in emotional weather. This constant attunement is exhausting, but it becomes normal. Over time, the nervous system learns that safety lies not in inner solidity, but in responsiveness, not in standing, but in bending. Such a system learns very early that authority equals threat. Authority meant unpredictability. Authority meant consequences you could not control. Authority meant that something essential depended on forces outside you. So the body learned to soften, to appease, to stay mobile rather than rooted. Even when authority was not overtly violent, it was experienced as asymmetrical. One side spoke, the other adjusted. Now imagine what happens when authority begins to arise from within. The nervous system does not immediately recognize it as benevolent. It reacts as it always has. Muscles tighten, Breath becomes shallow, thoughts begin to justify, explain, or retreat. The body does not yet know the difference between external domination and internal alignment. To it, authority is authority. This is why many people report that when they finally assert a boundary, even a healthy one, they feel ill afterward, dizzy, guilty, disoriented, sometimes even panicked. The ego says, "This is ridiculous. I did nothing wrong." But the body remembers another truth. It remembers that asserting oneself once meant danger. Here we must understand that adaptation is not chosen freely. It is learned under pressure, and what is learned under pressure is not unlearned by insight alone. You cannot reason your way out of a nervous system that was shaped by years of vigilance. Authority must be embodied gradually, otherwise it feels like violence against the self. This is why premature authority often becomes caricature. People who have adapted too long may suddenly swing to rigidity, absolutism, or cold detachment. They believe they are finally being strong, but in truth, they are acting out a shadow image of authority, not yet integrated. It is authority without eros, without relatedness, without warmth. This, too, feels wrong and often sends them back into adaptation, convinced they have failed at selfhood. But this oscillation is part of the process. The psyche learns by contrast. Let me bring in the image of the archetype, for without it, we remain trapped in personal biography. Authority is not merely a personal function, it is an archetypal one. In its healthy form, it belongs to the archetype of the king or queen, the inner ordering principle that establishes boundaries, meaning, and direction. But when this archetype is not allowed to develop consciously, it appears in distorted forms, either projected outward onto leaders, partners, or institutions, or split into the shadow as tyranny, coldness, or cruelty. Those who adapt excessively often idealize authority in others while fearing it in themselves. They are drawn to strong figures, decisive personalities, emotionally dominant partners, because these figures carry the archetype they have disowned. At the same time, they resent them, depend on them, fear them, all at once. This ambivalence is the mark of projection. When the archetype begins to return home, the projection collapses, and collapse is rarely comfortable. The psyche must withdraw energy from old attachments, old loyalties, old identifications. Authority no longer belongs out there. It must be carried, and carrying it feels heavy at first, because the muscles of inner leadership have never been trained. In dreams, this phase often appears as the image of an inheritance, a crown that feels too heavy, a house that must be maintained, a responsibility that no one else seems willing to take. The dream ego often resists, protests, or tries to give the object away. This is not laziness, it is unfamiliarity. The psyche has never been allowed to experience itself as central. Here I must emphasize something crucial. Discomfort is not a sign that authority is false. It is a sign that authority is new. What is truly false is the belief that comfort is the measure of truth. Comfort belongs to habit, truth belongs to transformation, and transformation always disturbs the equilibrium of the old personality. Authority feels uncomfortable because it confronts you with solitude. When you adapt, you are never fully alone. You are always in reference to someone or something else. But authority isolates. At least initially, decisions made from inner law cannot always be explained in ways others understand. You may find yourself less inclined to justify, less able to translate your choices into socially pleasing narratives. This can feel like exile, yet this solitude is not pathological. It is initiatory. In many ancient traditions, initiation into authority required separation, time in the wilderness, withdrawal from the familiar, not because society was rejected, but because the individual needed to encounter an inner center strong enough to stand without constant reflection from others. Modern psychology often forgets this dimension, but the psyche has not. Authority feels uncomfortable because it ends the illusion that harmony can be maintained at all costs. Adaptation believes that if one tries hard enough, understands deeply enough, sacrifices sufficiently, conflict can be eliminated. Authority knows otherwise. It knows that conflict is sometimes the price of truth, and that peace bought by self-betrayal poisons the soul slowly. This realization can feel cruel at first. You may ask yourself, have I become selfish, hard, unloving? But these questions arise from an old moral framework that equated love with self-erasure. A mature psyche knows that love without boundaries is not love, but fusion, and fusion eventually breeds resentment or emptiness. As authority integrates, something subtle shifts. You begin to feel less compelled to rescue, explain, or anticipate, not because you care less, but because you trust more. You trust the other's psyche to carry its own weight. You trust life to respond without constant interference. And you trust yourself to endure disapproval without collapse. This is deeply threatening to the adapted ego, which built its identity on usefulness. If I am not needed, who am I? Authority answers this question not with reassurance, but with presence. You are because you are, not because you perform. Let us pause here, because what follows is even more delicate. We must now explore how authority, once tolerated, begins to reorganize relationships, fate, and the very sense of meaning in one's life. This stage often brings losses that cannot be avoided, but also a depth that adaptation could never reach. If you are willing, we will continue into that territory next. Yes, let us continue, for we are now approaching the threshold where many turn back, not because they lack insight, but because what appears next feels like a kind of death. And in a psychological sense, it is when authority is no longer merely an inner disturbance but begins to stabilize. The outer world responds, relationships shift, roles dissolve, patterns that once depended on your accommodation begin to fail. This is often experienced as a sudden loss of harmony, yet nothing has been done violently or deliberately. You have not attacked, you have not withdrawn in protest. You have simply stopped adapting in ways that violated your inner law. To the adapted psyche, this feels shocking. For years, perhaps decades, you were rewarded for flexibility, empathy, endurance, You were the one who could handle it, who understood, who made things easier. Authority interrupts this silent economy, and economies do not collapse quietly. Others may react with confusion, disappointment, or subtle aggression. They may accuse you of changing, becoming cold, becoming difficult. This accusation cuts deeply because part of you still believes that being good means being easy to live with. Authority asks you to endure being misread without rushing to correct the misunderstanding. This is an advanced task of the psyche. Here we must speak of fate, for individuation is not only an inner journey, it is a reorientation of destiny. When you adapt excessively, your fate is entangled with the unmet needs of others. You become woven into their compensations. Your role is not random, it is archetypal. You carry what others cannot. You feel what others avoid. You hold what others split off. Authority breaks this spell. As you withdraw your unconscious participation, others are forced to confront what you once carried. Some will grow, some will turn away, some will seek to restore the old balance by guilt, obligation, or emotional pressure. Authority requires that you do not retaliate, but also that you do not submit. This is a narrow path, and it is why many feel they are failing when in truth they are simply learning to stand. In dreams during this phase, one often sees images of bridges breaking, ships leaving harbor, or companions disappearing along the road. These are not predictions, they are psychic acknowledgments. The old way cannot continue alongside the new one indefinitely. Something must be relinquished. Authority feels uncomfortable because it exposes a truth that adaptation concealed. Not all bonds are reciprocal. Some exist only because one side continually yields. When yielding stops, the bond reveals its true nature. This revelation can feel brutal, but it is clarifying. Let me speak now of the moral suffering that often arises here. Many adapted individuals have built their identity around being ethical, kind, spiritually mature. When authority enters, they may experience a deep inner conflict, as though they are betraying their highest values. They ask themselves, have I become less compassionate? But compassion that destroys the self is not a virtue. It is a wound mistaken for goodness. The psyche does not ask you to abandon care, it asks you to relocate it. Care must include the self, otherwise it becomes masochistic. Authority is the structure that allows care to flow without annihilation. At this point, the shadow undergoes another transformation. Earlier, it appeared as raw anger, rigidity, or withdrawal. Now, if authority is held consciously, the shadow softens, it becomes discernment, it becomes the capacity to say no without hatred, to leave without drama, to remain present without surrender. This is a subtle power, and because it is subtle, it is often overlooked. There is no triumph, no applause. The reward is a quiet coherence inside, a sense that your actions align with something deeper than fear or approval. Many report a strange loneliness here, but it is not the loneliness of abandonment, it is the loneliness of authorship. For the first time, your life is no longer written primarily in response to others. You are writing from within, and authorship, by its nature, cannot be delegated. You may notice that time feels different. Urgency decreases. The need to explain diminishes. Silence becomes more tolerable, even pleasurable. This is because authority stabilizes the psyche's center of gravity. You are no longer constantly pulled outward, yet paradoxically, this inner stability may coincide with outer uncertainty. Paths that once seemed clear dissolve. Roles you inhabited effortlessly no longer fit. This is not regression. It is reconfiguration. In alchemical terms, this is the nigredo, followed by the beginning of albedo, the blackening, the breakdown of old forms, gives way to a whitening, a simplification. Life becomes less dramatic, but more real, less performative, more essential. Authority feels uncomfortable because it strips away illusions of control through adaptation. You can no longer manage outcomes by pleasing, anticipating, or absorbing. You must tolerate not knowing how others will respond. This is a profound anxiety for the adapted psyche, which survive by prediction, but out of this uncertainty emerges trust. Not naive trust in people or systems, but trust in the self's capacity to respond creatively. You begin to sense that even if relationships end, even if roles fall away, something essential in you remains intact. This realization is not ecstatic, it is grounding. Let me speak briefly of love, because many fear that authority will make them unloving. In truth, authority makes love possible. Only a self that can stand apart can choose connection freely. Without authority, attachment is compulsion. With authority, relationship becomes encounter. Those who remain in your life after this transformation often relate to you differently. There is less drama, less fusion, but more respect. Some will say you feel calmer, others will say you feel distant. Both perceptions may be true, depending on what they sought from you. We are nearing the final movement of this inquiry. What remains is to understand how authority, once integrated, becomes service rather than isolation, and how the discomfort that marked its arrival gradually gives way to a form of inner peace that is not dependent on approval or harmony. If you wish, we will move into that closing terrain. Then let us move into this final terrain, where authority no longer announces itself as disturbance, nor hides itself behind hardness, but becomes something quieter, almost invisible to the outside world, yet unmistakable to the one who lives from it. When authority has been sufficiently endured, something unexpected occurs. The tension that once accompanied it begins to dissolve, not because the world has become more agreeable, but because the psyche has ceased negotiating its right to exist. Authority no longer feels like an act, it feels like gravity. At this stage, many are surprised to discover that their lives have not become louder, more dominant, or more imposing. Quite the opposite. There is often a reduction of unnecessary movement, fewer explanations, fewer emotional negotiations, fewer internal arguments. Authority, once integrated, does not shout, it regulates. This is the point at which authority transforms into service. I must be precise here, because the word service has been abused by moralism. What I mean is not self-sacrifice, nor submission, nor martyrdom. I mean that the psyche, once centered, naturally participates in the world without losing itself. It gives where giving is true and withholds where withholding is necessary. There is no inner debate. The action arises, and it is done. This is why the truly authoritative person often appears modest, even ordinary. There is no need to signal strength. The energy once consumed by adaptation is now available for perception, creativity, and depth. Life feels simpler, though not easier in a superficial sense. The adapted self was complex because it was divided. Authority simplifies because it unifies. You may notice that your relationship to suffering changes. You still feel pain, sometimes deeply, but you no longer feel responsible for pain that does not belong to you. This is a profound shift. Earlier in life, you may have absorbed suffering automatically, believing it was love, empathy, or duty. Now, suffering is recognized as meaningful, but not interchangeable. Each psyche has its own burden. This recognition does not harden the heart, it refines it. In dreams at this stage, images often become calmer, the threatening figures recede, the abandoned houses become inhabitable, the long journeys end in quiet places. These are not fantasies of escape, they are symbols of psychic homecoming. Authority feels natural now because it is no longer reactive. It does not arise in opposition to others, but in alignment with the self. There is no inner rebellion, no compensatory assertion. The old fear of becoming cruel dissolves, because cruelty was never authority, it was defense. One of the clearest signs that authority has integrated is the disappearance of guilt without cause. You may still feel remorse when you truly harm another, and this is healthy, but the vague, chronic guilt that once followed every act of self-definition fades. In its place comes responsibility. Responsibility is heavier than guilt, but it is also cleaner. Guilt binds you to the past. Responsibility anchors you in the present. You become less interested in being understood. This is often misinterpreted as indifference, but it is something else entirely. It is the recognition that understanding cannot be forced without distortion. Those who are ready will sense your coherence. Those who are not will project their own narratives. You no longer rush to manage these projections. Here, the adapted persona finally retires. Not dramatically, not with bitterness, but with relief. It has done its work. It preserved you when preservation was necessary. Now it steps aside. This is not rejection of your past self. It is gratitude followed by release. Authority integrated in this way has a paradoxical effect on love. You may love fewer people, but you love them more truthfully. There is less intensity, but more durability, less longing, but more presence. Relationships become places of meeting rather than rescue missions, and something else happens, something subtle yet decisive. You begin to sense meaning not as something to be achieved, but as something that unfolds when the psyche is aligned. Meaning is no longer sought, it is recognized. This is why many who reach this stage describe a quiet joy that has no obvious cause. Life has not necessarily improved in all external respects. There may still be uncertainty, limitation, even loss, but the inner conflict that once drained vitality has largely ceased. Energy flows where it is needed. Rest occurs without collapse. Authority no longer feels uncomfortable because it no longer contradicts your identity. It is your identity, not as an image, but as a lived structure. You are not authoritative. You are authored. Let me end by saying this. If you are still in the discomfort, still in the trembling, still in the oscillation between adaptation and assertion, do not despair. You are not failing. You are early. The psyche unfolds in sequences, not leaps. What feels unbearable now will later feel foundational. Authority is not the enemy of love. It is the condition that makes love real. And when authority finally comes home to the soul, it does not announce itself with triumph. It arrives as silence that no longer needs to be filled, as a presence that no longer needs permission, as a life that no longer asks whether it is allowed to be lived. That is the end of adaptation and the beginning of wholeness. Even after this homecoming, the psyche continues to deepen. For wholeness is not a static state, but a living relationship with the self. Many believe that once authority is integrated, the journey ends. In truth, something more delicate begins. Authority no longer concerns itself primarily with boundaries or survival. It turns toward meaning, toward the question not of how to stand, but of why one stands at all. At this point, a strange humility emerges, not the humility of submission, but the humility of proportion. You begin to sense yourself as a participant in something larger than personal history. The ego, once exhausted by adaptation and later hardened by defense, now learns to serve the self rather than impersonate it. Authority, here, is no longer about control or even direction. It becomes listening. This surprises many. They expect authority to mean certainty, but mature authority includes uncertainty without panic. It allows mystery without collapsing into confusion. The psyche, having secured its center, can now tolerate the unknown. It does not need to rush toward answers to quiet fear. In this phase, dreams often take on a numinous quality. Symbols appear that do not demand interpretation so much as reverence. Light without source, figures without clear identity, landscapes that feel timeless. These are not messages in the ordinary sense. They are encounters. The psyche is no longer compensating, it is communing. Here we meet the religious function of the psyche. Though I do not mean religion in its institutional form, I mean the natural orientation of the soul toward that which transcends the ego. Authority that has passed through adaptation and individuation no longer seeks to dominate life, it seeks to align with its deeper rhythms. This alignment often brings a renewed sense of vocation. Though it may not resemble career or productivity, vocation here means being called into a particular way of being. Some are called into quiet mentorship, some into creative expression, some into simple presence. Authority allows you to hear this call without translating it into social reward. You may notice that ambition fades, but purpose sharpens. You want less, yet you mean more. The adapted self was driven by necessity. The individuated self is guided by resonance. What fits stays, what does not falls away, often without struggle. There is also a reconciliation with the past, not by rewriting it, but by integrating it. The years of adaptation are no longer experienced as wasted. They are seen as preparation. You understand, perhaps for the first time, that the psyche needed to bend before it could stand, that sensitivity preceded strength, that endurance preceded authority. This realization brings compassion for your former self and for others still caught in adaptation. But this compassion is no longer entangling. You do not rush to awaken them. You trust their timing, as you have learned to trust your own. Authority, in its final form, does not seek disciples. It invites encounter. One of the clearest signs of this stage is a changed relationship to endings. Earlier, endings felt catastrophic. The adapted self experienced separation as annihilation. Later, endings felt necessary but painful. Now, endings are recognized as transitions. They carry grief, yes, but also inevitability. You do not cling, you do not dramatize, you allow. This capacity to allow is not passivity. It is strength refined by insight. It arises only when the psyche knows it will not disappear if a form dissolves. Authority here is inseparable from trust in the continuity of being. If I may speak personally for a moment, this is the authority I came to recognize late in life, walking by the lake, carving stone, listening more than speaking, not the authority of theory, nor of reputation, but of inward alignment. When one lives from this place, life may still wound, but it no longer fragments. And so, if you are listening to these words and feel both resonance and distance, know this: the psyche does not move by command, it moves by readiness. Authority cannot be forced. It emerges when adaptation has completed its task and can no longer protect you from yourself. Do not hurry this moment. Do not idealize it. Do not fear it. Authority will feel uncomfortable precisely until it is no longer borrowed, resisted, or performed. When it becomes simply how you breathe, how you choose, how you stand in silence, the discomfort will vanish, not because life has become easy, but because you have become congruent. And that congruence, quiet and unremarkable to the world, is one of the rarest achievements of the human soul. There is still one final layer we must touch, because even after congruence is reached, the psyche continues to test it. Authority, once embodied, is not left undisturbed. Life will quietly ask, is this authority real, or is it merely a refined identity? This testing does not arrive dramatically. It comes subtly, almost mundanely, in moments when you are tired, when you are unseen, when no one rewards your coherence, when doing what is aligned costs you something tangible, and doing what is old would bring immediate relief. These moments are decisive, though they rarely feel important at the time. Here, authority reveals its deepest nature. You begin to notice that you no longer experience authority as something you use. You experience it as something you answer to. The center of gravity has shifted completely. Earlier in life, you answered to circumstances, expectations, emotional climates. Later, you answered to a newly discovered sense of self. Now, you answer to something quieter still, an inner necessity that does not negotiate. This is where many misunderstand Jung when they believe individuation ends in ego strength. Ego strength is only the bridge. What lies beyond is ego transparency. The ego becomes a vessel, not a commander. Authority no longer belongs to the ego at all. It belongs to the self, and the ego's task is fidelity. Fidelity is not dramatic. It does not feel heroic. It feels ordinary and exacting. You know when you betray it. There is no punishment, no explosion, but a faint loss of inner tone, like a string gone slightly out of tune. And because you now know that tone, you cannot ignore it. At this stage, temptation takes a new form. It is no longer the temptation to please or to disappear. It is the temptation to solidify, to turn your authority into an identity, a position, a moral superiority. This is subtle, and many fall into it without noticing. They become the one who has boundaries, the one who sees clearly, the one who no longer adapts. But this, too, is a regression, though a sophisticated one. True authority does not need to be defended. You may notice that when you are most aligned, you are also most permeable. You can hear criticism without collapsing. You can receive feedback without submitting. You can even be wrong without disintegrating. This is not because you have become indifferent, but because your worth is no longer negotiated externally or internally. It is assumed. This assumption is not arrogance. Arrogance arises when worth is uncertain and must be asserted. Authority arises when worth is no longer questioned. Something else changes here. Your relationship to time. The adapted psyche lived in anticipation. The emerging authority lived in tension. The integrated authority lives in rhythm. You no longer rush awakening, healing, or outcomes. You sense when to act and when to wait, not by strategy, but by attunement. This attunement is what ancient traditions try to describe with words like wisdom, though wisdom itself is only a shadow of the experience. In this rhythm, you may find yourself stepping out of roles you once thought defined you, not with rebellion, not with explanation, but with a quiet refusal to continue misalignment.